Discount rack special. My brother jeered, pointing at me. His voice cut through the soft melody of the string quartet like a crack in a crystal glass. He wanted an audience, and in the gilded hall celebrating my parents' 40 years of marriage, he got one. Every eye turned. Cousins, aunts, old family friends. Their gazes landed on me, then on the simple navy dress I wore. It was elegant, understated. It had no rank, no insignia, no medals. It was the armor of a woman trying to be a daughter for one night, not a soldier. Mark's smile was wide, predatory. He was a vice president at some tech firm now, a world of hostile takeovers and market disruption. He saw every conversation as a battlefield to be won, every family gathering a territory to be marked. He took a theatrical step closer, lowering his voice into a stage whisper that carried across the polished floor. Seriously, Anya? You could have at least tried. Mom and Dad deserved better than your bargain bin effort. The words were a perfectly calibrated munition, designed for maximum collateral damage in a room full of people who valued appearances above all else. I felt the heat crawl up my neck, a slow, familiar burn. My hand tightened on the stem of my champagne flute, the glass cold against my skin. I didn't answer. In my world, silence is a strategic choice. You don't engage with non-credible threats. You observe, you assess, you wait for the operational picture to develop. But this wasn't a briefing room. This was my family. And the operational picture was humiliating. My father looked uncomfortable. My mother's smile was a brittle, painted-on thing. They believed in keeping the peace, even if it meant letting their son detonate a small grenade in the middle of their party. Mark was about to speak again, to press his advantage. I could see it in his eyes. The final, killing blow to my composure. Then, a new voice entered the airspace. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was calm, precise, and carried an authority that Mark's boardroom bravado could never imitate. "Excuse me." The voice came from a man standing near the bar. He was in a simple gray suit, salt and pepper hair, posture ramrod straight. He was a guest of my cousin's, I think. I'd never seen him before. Mark turned, annoyed at the interruption. The man didn't look at him. His eyes were fixed on me, not my face, but my shoulder, on the delicate beaded pattern over the fabric that I'd thought was just a fashion detail. His gaze was analytical, the look of a man who has spent a lifetime identifying threats, assets, and chains of command in a single, sweeping glance. The Major's eyes fixed on my shoulder. "Ma'am, your silver stars. Everyone can see them." Every voice stopped a T once. The string quartet faltered, a violin screeching into the sudden, cavernous void. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversation. It all ceased to exist. The air in the room became a solid thing, heavy and unbreathable. Someone dropped a fork. The silver clang against marble was the only sound in the world. Mark's smile didn't just fade. It was wiped from his face, leaving behind a slack-jawed, pale confusion. He looked from the man to me and back again. The battlefield he thought he commanded had just vanished from under his feet. Silver stars. 2 words. He spoke them so quietly, but they landed with the force of an artillery strike. They redrew every line in the room, redefined every relationship, and shattered. A story my brother had been telling himself, and me, for 20 years. The man in the gray suit gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, a sign of profound respect. An apology for having to speak at all. I just stood there, the woman in the discount dress, bathed in a silence that was louder than any insult my brother had ever thrown at me. That silence in the hall had an echo. It took me back 18 years to another room, another judgment. The battlefield then was my parents' dining table. The weapon of choice was my college application. I'd chosen a liberal arts program, and my brother Mark, home for the weekend from business school, treated it like a personal insult. "An arts degree?" he said, pushing a piece of roast beef around his plate. "What's the strategic objective there, Anya? A career in professional daydreaming?" He looked at my father for support. "It's just directionless." That was his favorite word for me. Directionless. A ship without a rudder, a project without a plan. I was a line item in the family budget that just wasn't performing to his expectations. I had no answer for him then. My silence was shame. My shame was his victory. 2 weeks later, I found my direction. It was in a strip mall, wedged between a laundromat and a pizza place. The sign on the door just said, Armed Forces Recruiting. The air inside was cold, smelling of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. A sergeant with a bored expression slid a stack of papers across his metal desk. I wasn't thinking about patriotism. I wasn't thinking about service or sacrifice. I was thinking about Mark's smirk. I was thinking that if my world was going to be a battlefield anyway, I might as well learn how to fight. The pen scraped across the paper, black ink dragging my name into a future he could never have imagined for me. It wasn't an enlistment. It was an exit strategy. Officer Candidate School was designed to find the crack in your soul and pry it open. Fort Benning in July is not a place, it's a physical state of being. The Georgia humidity was a wet uniform you could never take off. The red clay stained everything. Cadre voices stripped your name away until you were just candidate, a problem to be solved. They broke me down. They broke all of us down. But they were looking for the ones who could put themselves back together, stronger than before. My breaking point came during land navigation, alone in the pine forests, with a map, a compass, and a list of grid coordinates. The heat was suffocating. Every tree looked the same. The compass needle felt like it was mocking me, spinning between two equally wrong paths. I was behind schedule, drenched in sweat, my own frustration a buzzing noise in my ears. I was lost. I sank down against a tree, the bark digging into my back. This was it. Mark was right. I was directionless. Then I heard them. 2 other candidates moving through the trees nearby. Their voices were low, smug. Told you she wouldn't make it. The words were a gut punch. They sounded just like my brother. I closed my eyes and I could see his face, that confident smirk. I felt that old familiar shame wash over me. For a moment, I let it. But then, something else rose up. Not shame, something harder, colder. The smirk in my mind became a target. The shame turned into fuel. I got to my feet, my legs shaking. I looked at the soggy map, not as a puzzle, but as an enemy position to be taken. I wasn't running from his voice anymore. I was moving toward my objective. 1 point, then the next. I moved through the woods with a purpose that felt like it was forged in that very moment. I found my last marker just as the sun was dipping below the tree line. He called me directionless. But out there, with nothing but a compass in my hand and iron in my veins, I had finally found my true north. I chose logistics as my branch out of officer candidate school. When I told my brother, he laughed. So, a professional clerk. Got it? A nice, safe desk job. My first desk was at Forward Operating Base Griffin, a dust-choked outpost in the Horn of Africa where the heat never broke, and the only thing separating us from them was a wall of dirt-filled barriers and a roll of concertina wire. I was Captain Anya, company commander of a forward support company. My job was to run the convoys, pushing beans, bullets, and blood out to the remote combat outposts. It was the furthest thing from a desk job. The bars on my collar felt heavier than they were. I was 26 years old, in command of 150 soldiers, most of whom had more deployment time than I had time in service. My first sergeant, a man named Miller with a face like a worn leather map and eyes that had seen everything, was polite. But it was a careful, professional politeness. He was waiting to see if the new CO was going to get someone killed. The test came on a Tuesday. We were in the TOC for the morning convoy brief. The S2 intel officer was pointing at a digital map, his laser pointer circling a stretch of road we called Route Irish. We have new chatter. Credible threat of a complex IED attack. Route is red. I repeat, Route Irish is red. My stomach went cold. Our destination was Cop Viper, an outpost at the ragged edge of our operational area. Their report from the night before was stark. They were low on everything. Water, ammunition, plasma. The battalion commander's voice crackled over the radio from the main base. He'd seen the intel. His orders were clear. Stand down, Griffin 6 Charlie. We do not roll on a compromised route. Wait for end of day to clear it. 48 hours minimum. 48 hours. I looked at the supply numbers for Viper. They didn't have 48 hours. I turned to First Sergeant Miller and my platoon sergeants. Close the door. We stood around the map, the red icons pulsing like angry wounds. The BC is right, I said. We aren't taking Irish. I looked at Miller, whose expression was unreadable stone. But we aren't waiting. I pointed to a thin, winding line on the topographical overlay, miles to the west. A dried-out riverbed, a wadi. It was treacherous, unpaved terrain. It was also completely hidden from the main road. The intel is focused on the hardball road, I said. They won't be looking for us in the wadi. First Sergeant, what do your scouts say about that ground? Miller's eyes met mine. For the first time, I think he saw a commander, not just a captain. He saw a willingness to trust the NCOs on the ground. A flicker of something changed in his expression. He nodded slowly. It's rough. It'll be slow, but it's passable. The convoy rolled out an hour before dusk. I wasn't in the lead truck. I was in the TOC, a prisoner to the blue dots on the screen and the static hiss of the radio. Every minute of silence was a lifetime. Hours later, the call came in. Mission complete. All trucks inside the wire at Viper. The relief was a physical thing. It almost brought me to my knees. When they rolled back in the next morning, coated in a layer of pale dust but all in one piece, the whole fob felt lighter. Later, I was hunched over paperwork when Miller walked into my office. He didn't say a word. He just placed a steaming mug of brutally black coffee on my desk. He looked at the map, still on my screen, with the winding, improvised path we'd taken. Good route, ma'am. He paused, turning to leave. Then he stopped at the door. Good run, Pathfinder. He left. I stared at the coffee. My brother thought I was a clerk. The Army would give me a medal for that mission, and I'd put it in a drawer. But that name, that call sign, that I would keep. The years after that first command became a blur of new ranks, new postings. The world became a series of sterile offices and temporary quarters. As a major, I was a battalion executive officer. My life was color-coded spreadsheets, maintenance schedules, and the constant grinding logistics of keeping a unit combat ready. Then came the Army War College, a year of breathing the thin air of strategy and policy. Promotion to lieutenant colonel brought me to the Pentagon. I was a staff officer, a ghost in the machine, writing policy papers that would affect soldiers I would never meet. The work was vital, but deeply impersonal. Then came a colonel's command. Brigade S3, the operations officer. I was back with troops, planning large-scale joint exercises in the desert. The days were long, the nights were short, and the pressure was immense. With every step up, the phone calls home became more difficult. The distance wasn't just geographical, it was existential. I was speaking a language they didn't understand, living a life they couldn't comprehend. Mark's condescension evolved. It was no longer outright mockery. It was worse. It was pity. Still playing soldier, Anya? He'd ask during a strained holiday phone call. I'd be in my office, the sun setting over a dusty motor pool, and he'd be at a family dinner I was missing. It was a good run, but don't you think it's time to get a real life? A real life. To him, that meant a husband, a mortgage, a 401k, a life he could measure on a spreadsheet. My world, a world of service and sacrifice, didn't compute. It was a phase I was supposed to grow out of. One year, I had to take a Christmas video call from a command tent in the middle of a desert rotation. Through the pixelated screen, I saw them all gathered. The warm lights of the tree, the festive sweaters. My nephew opened the gift I had mailed 2 months earlier. I was a ghost at my own family's celebration. After the call, I walked out into the cold desert night and looked up at the stars. I had never felt so alone. The promotion list came out on a Tuesday. I found my name on a secure website, a line of black text on a white screen. Colonel Anya, selected for promotion to Brigadier General. There was no fanfare, just an official email. The ceremony was in my commanding officer's office. It was small, quiet, and professional. Just a handful of colleagues, a flag, a single silver star on a small velvet box. I didn't invite my family. How could I explain to them what this meant? How could I articulate that this wasn't an achievement like a bonus or a corner office? That it was a covenant, a promise. My commanding officer, a 3-star general, took the star and pinned it firmly onto my shoulder. The sharp point pressed through the fabric for a moment, a tiny, fleeting pain. I had spent years imagining this moment. I thought it would feel like a victory, a final, crushing checkmate in a long game against my brother's doubt. I expected triumph, but that's not what I felt. Instead, I felt weight, an immense, sobering weight. It wasn't a burden. It was the sudden, crushing gravity of responsibility. I thought of the thousands of soldiers who would now be under my command. Their readiness, their welfare, their lives, their families. It had been years since my brother's voice was the fuel. But in that moment, any lingering echo of it vanished for good. This wasn't about him. It was about them. It was about being worthy of the trust embodied in that small, heavy piece of silver. "Get a real life," he had said. I looked down at the star on my shoulder. This was the realest life I had ever known. My apartment is quiet. It's a minimalist space in a high-rise, with clean lines and very little furniture. Everything has its place. It's less of a home and more of a personal forward operating base. A place to rearm and refit between missions. My current mission was my parents' anniversary party. I opened my closet. The divide inside was a perfect metaphor for my life. On the left, my career. Rows of perfectly pressed uniforms. The Army service uniform I had worn to a briefing just yesterday was hanging at the front. The dark blue jacket was immaculate. On each shoulder board sat 2 silver stars, polished to a mirror shine. Major General, Deputy Commanding General of Army Materiel Command. My role was to oversee the logistics that supplied a global force. A budget with 9 zeros. A responsibility for tens of thousands of soldiers. That uniform was a tangible thing. It was respect, authority, and the culmination of an entire life's work. It was the heaviest thing I owned. On the right side of the closet was the other Anya, a small, sparse collection of civilian clothes, most of them bought out of necessity, worn once or twice. They were the costume of a person I rarely got to be. My hand hovered there, in the space between those 2 worlds. I could have chosen something else. A power suit. An expensive designer dress that would speak my brother's language of money and status. I could have worn my own armor into his arena, but my finger traced the simple fabric of a navy blue dress hanging at the end of the rack. I'd bought it a week ago off the rack at a department store, no label, no pretense. It was just a dress. Choosing it was a conscious, strategic decision. Tonight wasn't about winning. I had given up on that objective years ago. Tonight was about an attempt at connection, a diplomatic gesture. For one night, I wanted to walk into that room and not be the directionless little sister or the overachieving soldier. I wanted to be just Anya, a daughter, a sister. This dress was my white flag. It was an act of voluntary disarmament. I was choosing to walk onto my brother's battlefield without my rank, without my shield. I was offering a truce, hoping that if I met them on their terms, in their world, they might finally see me. It was a fool's hope, probably. A high-risk, low-probability of success operation. I knew that. A part of me, the seasoned commander, assessed the terrain and knew the mission would likely fail. My brother's psychological operations were too entrenched. But the other part of me, the part that still remembered being a little girl in that house, had to try. I took the blue dress off the hanger. The fabric was light in my hands, a stark contrast to the weighted wool of my uniform. I put it on. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. A woman in a simple blue dress. For a second, that's all I saw. Then, habit took over. My shoulders squared themselves, pulling back into a familiar, rigid posture. My chin lifted. The woman in the mirror was no longer just a woman. Her bearing gave her away. The general was still there, embedded in the very framework of her bones. I took a deep breath, the way a soldier does before stepping out of the wire. A final moment of calm before entering hostile territory. Then I picked up my keys and walked out the door wearing my flimsy armor of hope. The silence that followed was a physical presence. It filled the spaces between the crystal glasses and the silver platters. It was heavier than any word, louder than any insult my brother had ever spoken. It was the sound of a reality collapsing. My gaze swept the room. It was a commander's assessment of the terrain after the battle was over. My parents stood frozen, their faces a mixture of shock and utter confusion. They looked from me to my brother and back again, as if trying to reconcile 2 completely different intelligence reports on their own children. For the first time, they were seeing the map, not just the tiny corner of it they had lived in. Then I looked at Mark. The color had drained from his face, leaving behind a pale, waxy sheen under the ballroom lights. His mouth was slightly open, his lifelong armor of arrogance and condescension vaporized in an instant. He was disarmed, defeated, not by an attack, but by a single, quiet statement of fact. His mouth worked, trying to form a word. "Anya," he stammered. I didn't know." An apology was coming. a desperate attempt to rewrite the history of the last 20 years, to reframe his cruelty as simple ignorance. A part of me, the little sister who had spent years craving his approval, waited for it. But the general officer standing in that hall did not. I met his eyes. I gave him no anger, no triumph. I gave him nothing. Just a long, quiet, final look. It was the end of the conversation, the end of the war. With that, I turned away from him, a deliberate, final pivot. My attention shifted to the major, who stood respectfully a few feet away. My posture changed, my bearings settled into the familiar lines of command presence. The air around me became my own. "Major," I said, my voice calm and clear. "Thank you for the courtesy." He gave a crisp, professional nod. "Of course, ma'am." In that small exchange, a world my family could never enter was acknowledged. We were two officers, observing a protocol that superseded everything else in the room. I gave a polite, fleeting nod to my parents. There was nothing to say. No explanation I could give them that would make sense of the chasm that had just opened up at their feet. Then I turned, and I walked. It was not a retreat. It was an advance in a new direction. My back was straight, my steps were measured. I didn't look back. I could feel the weight of every eye in that room on me, but they no longer mattered. Years ago, I had walked into a recruiter's office to run away from my brother's voice. Now, I was walking away from his silence. This time, I wasn't running from anything. I was simply leaving it behind, an artifact from a former life. His laughter used to fill every room, but the silence he left me with, that was all my own. He spent a lifetime trying to define me by what he thought I was. He was loud, and for a long time, I let his voice be the only one I heard. If anyone has ever tried to write you into a smaller story than the one you were meant to live, tell me in the comments how you finally wrote your own ending.